Hi everyone, welcome to Search for Understanding on Cable 10. Our theme for the next half hour is politics and poverty, the impact of the Mike Harris government on the economy of Ontario. We're going to ask the question, what can government do about poverty? And we might even try and define what poverty is. My guests this afternoon are John Clarke of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty and Robert Metz of the Freedom Party of Ontario. Guys, welcome.
Hi, John. Thank you.
John Clarke, I'll start with you. You're described by your organization, and I'll quote here, as a very prominent and militant anti-poverty activist, unquote. Now, poverty might be a growing phenomenon, but I'll bet it doesn't pay very well. What does a militant anti-poverty activist, how does he earn a living, and what is the Ontario Coalition all about?
Well, the Coalition Against Poverty is an umbrella organisation of anti-poverty groups, unemployed workers associations in different communities in Ontario. We come out of a march that was organised in 1989 where people got together and marched across Ontario. At that time we realised there was a need for a long-term organisation of the unemployed and poor, and we've been in the process of building it ever since, with our work of course being transformed over the last year and a bit with the advent of the Mike Harris government. As to how I personally survive, well, I'm the only full-time organiser within the organisation, and I'd very naturally be happy to swap paychecks with Mike Harris.
Robert Metz, on a previous program we did with Lindsay's David St. John, I asked you, Freedom Party, freedom from what? And you responded with words to this effect, freedom from government intrusion into our lives. Does the problem of poverty, as you see it, call for less government or more government involvement?
Well, I don't look at government in terms of less and more. I look at it in terms of proper or improper government. I think government can do things to alleviate poverty. I don't think that the things I would recommend government do probably wouldn't be the things that John would agree with. I think that the type of things government can do to alleviate poverty is to lower taxes and universality in social programs so that we can direct more resources to the people who need it. You know, have certain elements of right-to-work legislation, ease up the labor market so people can get access to the labor force or to the job market more readily. There's just a lot of things that can be done in that sense that government can do. Most of it is undoing a lot of the legislation that's done now, and one thing certainly government cannot do is create jobs. Government can take one job from one person and create another job magically by taking the resources from somewhere else, but to actually create the job, it's not doing that, it's just transferring wealth. And transference of wealth does not solve poverty.
Poverty then, speaking of it, let's try to define what the problem is. There are statistics that indicate that poverty is more widespread now than at any time since 1962, and if you don't like those statistics, there are other statistics. An organization called Campaign 2000 has indicated that insofar as child poverty is concerned, 24% of the kids in metropolitan Toronto live in poverty. Presumably the same statistics apply for the kids here in Lindsay. At the same time, we have apparently a widening gap between the rich and the poor, and we've seen the phenomenon of expanding and multiplying food banks. But on the other hand, we're constantly told that Canada is the best country in which to live. I'm self-employed, for instance, and as such, I eat what I kill, as it were. Any given year, my income might be down, and I would find myself living under the poverty line. But I have to say, if that's poverty, I can do that standing on my head. What is poverty, and do we have more poverty now than at any other time in the past? Let's start with you, John.
Well, I think undeniably we do have an incredible increase in poverty, and I think it reflects partly changes, of course, within the economy internationally, but I think it also represents a conscious attack that's being made on working people by governments, and Mike Harris is the prime example, the cutting edge of that agenda. What we have is a situation where mass unemployment has been perpetuated in this country. The central bank has a policy of maintaining a natural rate of unemployment of 9%, and it intervenes to ensure that those unemployment levels are maintained. At the same time as you have mass unemployment, you have an assault on the income support programs that people who are unemployed have traditionally been allowed to rely upon, unemployment insurance and welfare. Now, if you start to cut those programs at a time of high unemployment, you of course create, you strengthen the bargaining power of employers vis-à-vis workers, and you create a situation where it's possible to drive down wages, and so that poverty doesn't only become a reflection of unemployment, it becomes a reflection of working for low wages as well. For those two reasons, I think you're seeing an incredible proliferation of poverty that's absolutely undeniable.
Bob Metz, is there as much poverty as John Clarke would have us believe?
There's as much poverty as we're willing to pay for through government programs, and there's as much poverty as we're willing to define, depending how you want to define poverty. I mean, I found myself in that poverty class, so to speak, but I would never have considered myself poor. To me, I see poverty as a broad social condition from which people could not possibly pull themselves up, even if they tried their best and used every opportunity they had at their disposal, which I don't think would apply to countries like North America, for example, or the US or Canada. We still have relatively free economies, although they're being overburdened and increasingly burdened with taxes and regulations and labor legislation that is aimed to keep people out. I agree that there's sort of a conspiracy out there to keep people unemployed, but it's certainly not coming from cutbacks in government or from employers themselves. They, you know, employers want to see an active workforce too, because that means that they're making money.
Do you want to respond to that, John?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that employers want to see an active workforce, but what they also want to see is people working for the lowest possible wage. Now, the notion that you have employers being fettered by governments who are increasingly regulating things, I mean, the political climate, of course, is moving in exactly the opposite direction. The erosion of programs that's going on. The fact is that, you know, Mr. Metz 10 years ago would have been regarded perhaps as somebody crying in the wilderness, but I'm struck by hearing him speak how far governments over the last 10 years have moved precisely in the direction he's talking about. Deregulation, privatisation, the removal of programs, the weakening of things that were regarded as social rights a number of years ago. Employers, yes, they don't just want an active labour force, they want a submissive labour force, and the policies that are being delivered by governments are increasingly generating that.
Surely 100 years ago, though, if you were poor, that was it. There was no help for you. Whereas now we have all kinds of government programs and social welfare agencies to look after the poor. And any comment on that? Surely we are moving away from a society where poverty is all pervasive.
Well, actually, I mean, it's certainly true that we have a level of social provision that didn't exist 100 years ago. But also, we do not have a level of social provision that existed 10 years ago. The whole point is that the post-war period, say the period from the late 40s through till 75 or so, was marked by a strengthening of the social safety net, the birth of the so-called welfare state, a general improvement in terms of wages and living conditions and all the things that make life worth living for the majority of people. But what we've seen is an increasing process of eroding that, of moving back precisely in the direction of what existed 100 years ago.
Well, then governments could, if they wanted to, do something about poverty. Would you describe a formula for government involvement that would eliminate or reduce poverty in Ontario? Well,
you see, I would rather disagree with the proposition that you have this thing called government that can be benevolent or hostile depending on which way the wind blows. I mean, I think that when we're dealing with regimes such as those as in Queen's Park and Ottawa, we're dealing with business people, we're dealing with lawyers, we're dealing with people who basically are part and parcel of the system. And I don't think we can see them as a benevolent force. I think they're moving in a direction that are dictated by the demands of the corporations and the banks that they themselves answer to and are part of. I think the issue is to confront that. The issue is to push back. The issue is to refuse to accept the policies that they're ramming down our throats.
I think there's inherent in that comment is a major misunderstanding of what drives corporations and employers to take the tactics that they use. They are not omnipotent beings who can just pay whatever they want, charge whatever they want, or do whatever they want in the marketplace. They in turn are responding to millions and millions of consumers who buy their products, who vote every day with their dollars and their hands and their feet whether they support those corporations or not through the production of their products. And when they no longer meet that need, those corporations are as devoid of power and as devoid of influence as anything you could ever expect. You know, it's the same thing as Bill Gates said. If a company came out tomorrow and came out with some kind of a computer system that did away with his empire, it could happen overnight. He'd be broke. He's got to keep supplying a product that people can afford, that they want to buy, and that they're willing to buy. And that is the bottom line with all productive effort and all productive activity, is to create the goods that we need to survive.
And does government have a role then in alleviating poverty?
Well, it certainly has a role in not adding to it. And we add to poverty with all these laws and safety net provisions. Again, why do we have universal social programs in a country where most people should be able to afford taking care of their own needs, and we should only be directing government resources as a last resort to those few people who cannot? You know, poverty is caused by a lot of things. It's not just innocent and weak people who are poor. Most people are poor, from my experience, from what they do or choose not to do in terms of activity. Poverty is a natural condition. It is not brought upon someone by someone else making wealth.
Well, I think when somebody closes down a factory, for example, that could have a bearing on things.
Again, a factory doesn't close down just for a whimsical notion. It closes down for a reason. Maybe nobody's buying horse and buggies anymore. Maybe the factory no longer can compete with another factory that's doing the job better.
Or because a decision has been made to rationalise, streamline and speed up. I mean, the point is that people don't just confront corporations as consumers, where I would say you have in any case a rather inflated sense of their power, but they confront corporations as workers. They work in factories, they work in businesses, they work in shops, whatever. And it's precisely in that relationship that we're seeing an incredible erosion of people's gains and rights.
Well, this erosion came because of all those social programs we've had in the past. I mean, a lot of the people who are backing the big corporations and companies in Canada are just going to go to another country elsewhere where they don't place such a large burden on them to create the product that they want to create. I don't see any advantage to a country. Let me take a step back for a sec. You know, when we talk in Canada about government doing something about poverty, what we're really talking about 9 times out of 10 is the government taking away money from those people who aren't considered poor and handing it over to the people who are going to be considered poor through some welfare program. This is not an anti-poverty program. This is an emergency, last-ditch effort type of thing that you should be doing when you've hit the wall with something with a very few people for a very limited period of time. It's not an ongoing program that should be going constantly and getting bigger and bigger every year. As the facts attest, the more anti-poverty programs we have, the more poverty people we seem to have.
Well, let me give you an example. In 1991, the state of Michigan eliminated what's called down there general assistance, which essentially is welfare payments to single employable people. When they did it, the man who stood up in the state legislature and eliminated the program, who moved the motion within the legislature, said that this was tough love, to use his own expression, that it was going to remove the cycle of dependency, that those people were now going to be driven to go out and take the jobs that were there and all the rest of it. Some 3 years later, Wayne State University did a study amongst the population that had been cut off without a penny, and discovered that the unemployment rate amongst them was 87%, precisely because people had been rendered so utterly destitute that they had absolutely no chance of finding jobs, competing in the labour market or whatever else. I mean, the notion that if we were to eliminate programs wholesale, that poverty would disappear, simply flies in the face of
I would have assumed that the rate of unemployment was even higher while the program was in effect. Isn't that what the program's there to do, is to substitute for employment?
No, but precisely the point is that people that were cut off in overwhelming majority of cases found absolutely no employment at all. Now, a certain percentage of those people would in any case have found work with or without the system being there. But my point is that the elimination of a welfare program, the notion that somehow makes people self-sufficient and forces them to go out and do the things necessary and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, it's just an absurdity.
Without work and without the program, how were they surviving?
Well, people, of course, are not surviving
Well,
down
so
in
they're
Michigan.
dying?
People are
starving?
dying on the streets. People are selling their
In
blood
Michigan?
in order to survive. Of course they are.
I've
You go to-
never heard of any such reports.
Well, I'd suggest you,
I watched the Michigan
if you take a
television station, they don't report on
If you
it.
take a trip, I believe that's true, but if you get in your car and take a trip about similar to the one you took to get down here, you drive down to Detroit, you go across the border and you go into an area called the Cass Corridor, you'll see plenty of evidence of what the GA cuts have done to people.
Let's bring it back from Michigan
Sure.
for a moment back to Ontario and look at some of the specific key elements of the Mike Harris government policy. First of all, spending cuts, close to $8 billion worth proposed, reduction in tax rates by 30%, downsizing the civil service, and reduction in welfare rates, all of this being done in the name of deficit reduction and balancing budgets. Robert Metz, take two of those elements, the cuts to the government spending and cuts in the tax rates. If a government cuts a service, you and I perhaps can make up that service out of our own resources, or perhaps using the tax cut to do it. But I suspect the people that John Clarke represents can't afford that service on their own. Are we in danger of creating a society here where it's survival of the fittest?
Well, we always live in a society where survival of the fittest is the key, and we must make certain that our anti-poverty programs aren't designed to make the fittest not survive, which is what they really are. I mean, that's why the fittest people leave the country and go somewhere else where there are fewer burdens upon them. But tax cuts go hand in hand with cuts in spending. And as much as the Harris government is justifying its moves as cost-cutting measures, I would do the same thing, but I would never be justifying it because it saved costs. I would be justifying it because it's the right thing to do. You know, what we're really doing in a lot of cases is rewarding behavior that keeps people poor by giving them money for staying in that situation. Now, if there are people, for example, even in Michigan, who are staying in an area and not seeking to better themselves by their own effort, why the government should have the right to expropriate my effort to help someone who isn't doing that themselves, I don't see any justification for it. I consider it a moral issue, not an economic one. Again, I'm not talking about not helping people who cannot help themselves, but what percentage of people would that really be? It would be a very, very small percentage. Whereas the kinds of numbers we're talking about are very large groups and growing larger every day.
John, the argument is sometimes made, and you may even have made this argument yourself, I'm not sure, that the spending cuts of the Mike Harris government are in aid of fulfilling a campaign promise to reduce the tax burden on wealthy Ontarians. But if the government doesn't cut spending, it either has to borrow and go further into debt or raise taxes. In your opinion, what would be the implications of these two facts on the economy?
Well, I mean, I think we have a situation where this government has of course reached now something of an impasse. They find themselves now juggling this question of cuts and tax cuts. It's cuts to programs and tax cuts, and we have Ernie Eves completely unable to even come out and make a statement now. I mean, I think that's quite an historic development in terms of the life of this government. What they're prepared to do, what they seemed prepared to do, was to make absolutely unprecedented cuts in order to steer money in the direction of primarily upper income people. But what they've come up against in trying to do that is a growing resistance, which I think is something that needs to be introduced into this discussion. You see, when Mr. Metz talks in terms of, wouldn't it be nice to remove all these programs, wouldn't it be nice to do these things, I mean, that's his personal philosophy, and that's fine as far as it goes. But what he comes up against is the fact that people who are hungry and people who are seeing their living standards destroyed are just not prepared to accept that. They're going to resist that, they're going to fight back. The social programs that were won in this country, like unemployment insurance, like Medicare, they weren't some benevolent gift that came down from on high. They were won precisely because people organised to demand them. Now,
that's not true at all. That's not why we have those benefits. We have those benefits because they were promised to us by politicians back in the 60s who knew they couldn't work at the time, who knew that we'd run out in terms of demographics and in terms of you know, calling a pension plan something that's not even a pension plan. It's again another wealth transfer plan. If they had really created a pension plan, they would have taken money from each individual person and put that money aside and safeguarded it for that person's future. What they did was create a system that robbed Peter to pay Paul, and then they ran out of Peters.
No, the point I was making was precisely that it was the organising work of the unemployed in the 1930s that laid the framework and the basis for the programs that governments came to concede. A delegation appeared from the unemployed that went before R.B. Bennett, the Prime Minister of the 1930s, the Tory Prime Minister, and suggested the introduction of a program of unemployment insurance. And he threw them out of his office with the words that no government I'm part of will ever put a premium on idleness. But even R.B. Bennett, in the course of the next 5 years, was forced to put more money into relief programs than any government had previously done in Canadian history. And he didn't do that because he went out and saw the plight of the people and his heart melted. He did it because people fought back and people resisted. Now that's precisely the point I'm making now with regards to the Harris government. This is not some abstract debate. Harris is talking about going in and taking the food off of people's tables. He's talking about creating a situation where the bargaining power of people at the workplace is substantially reduced and their living standards are cut dramatically. And he better believe that people are going to fight back against that.
Picking up on some of the language you've been using and from the internet, and I want to quote some statements from your own organization. The coalition has organized bank occupations, a festival of noise-making and heckling, Harrisville, a tent city of food, song, and anti-Harris resistance, a Robin Hood March, which is a parade through the wealthiest neighborhoods to remind them of the suffering of the poor. Isn't some of this language a trifle baroque, and don't you run the risk of being marginalized or dismissed as wild-eyed radicals when you use words like anti-Harris resistance, for instance? You almost are describing an army of occupation and underground freedom fighters.
Well, some of the things you're reading out, I suspect your source is not directly from us, it's somebody...
Well, this is the Kitchener-Waterloo Coalition or chapter of the Coalition Against Poverty.
Okay, it wasn't something that came out of our office. But nonetheless, it's essentially correct. Certainly we believe that the historical record shows that if people are affected by poverty, they're going to get absolutely no consideration by making polite appearances before government committees and writing eloquent briefs and hoping to melt the government's heart. I think the record shows that it's the power to struggle against these things. It's the power to create a crisis for the government by precisely resisting what they do that has an effect. And I think we've gone well beyond the stage where we can talk about, you know, sort of fringe kooks who have no influence. We now have a situation where there is emerging in this province a huge social movement against what Mike Harris is doing. We've just seen the provincial capital shut down by a strike action. We've seen literally hundreds of thousands of people on the street against this government. And I must say, the cuts that he's promised have only begun to take effect. The welfare cut has had a devastating effect, an absolutely devastating effect, but it's only the first stage. Hospitals are going to close. There's going to be an incredible increase in human misery, and I think this movement that we see now is in fact only the early stages.
I think we have to look at the other side of the coin, though. Let's say government didn't start cutting back. Let's just assume that the unprecedented cutbacks you're talking about were just following on the heels of the unprecedented spending increases of the Ray government. So we're not really talking about going back before what was prior to Ray. But nevertheless, let's face it, all of these activities have been aimed not so much at the government as at business and as at the productive areas in society. Like when the unions came to London and shut London down, they didn't say we're protesting against the Harris government. They said we want to shut this community down. We want to take workers out of their productive areas of work and we want to put them out in the streets. To what avail? Who are they trying to hurt with that? I think what they're doing is expressing anger at Ontarians for voting the Harris government in.
Well, actually, I think that's the most important point of the whole anti-Harris struggle. The days of action.
Well, you're not going to win any friends that way.
Just 1 second. Has been precisely the fact that they've taken on the corporations directly, the people who write Harris's script for him.
But corporations employ people.
But you see, when workers start to actually withdraw their consent and actually engage in strike activity against the employers who put Mike Harris in power, I think they demonstrate the real power of this movement. And to suggest that people in London were not out there on the picket lines and a full part of that movement is an absurdity.
Well, there were a lot there. They weren't there too willingly. The ones I talked to, they were there because they felt they had to be, or that their unions would take some kind of action against them.
Perhaps you just spoke to the wrong people.
Well, they were on the radio for several days in a row, person after person calling in on open line shows, you know.
John, the Ontario government's program the so-called common sense revolution, was well known in advance of the election campaign. Essentially, we're getting now what we voted for. At what point do you have to say, what we're getting is the will of the people. If I don't like it, I'll vote them up the next time around. Or the more conventional route, create a political party, call it the Coalition Against Poverty Party. How about that for an idea?
Well, I'm prepared to concede that about a third of people who were eligible to cast ballots voted for Mike Harris in the last election. But I think people have every right to make a mistake and then rectify it. We're now in a situation, of course, where the real implications of what Harris was talking about doing are beginning to come home. We're seeing the latest Angus Reid poll I saw showed actually, I don't worship opinion polls, but we see the beginnings of a marked decline in popularity, down to 42% from this high of, I think it was 58 that took place a year ago. I think what we're starting to see, yes, is people are realising that the reality of the Harris agenda is very different to the theoretical promises that were made out there on the campaign trail. And I think that in the end, nobody's going to get a vote on whether my family has food on their table. If somebody attacks me in that way, I'm going to organise to resist.
Bob, I want to give you a quote from Hugh Segal, who is an advisor to Tory governments and Tory parties. And I'll quote, "Any government policy worth doing is worth doing gradually," unquote. Mike Harris seems to be trying to undo a trend that's been maybe 20 years in the making. There's goodwill out there for him. You just have to look at some of the polls, I think. But people seem to be telling him, I sense, slow down a bit and don't cut education and health care. Is the government going too far, too fast? And I know you're not a spokesman for the government, but you're an informed observer.
That's a question that again is very subjective. For me, they're not going far enough or fast enough. For John, I'm sure they're going too far, too fast. So it depends upon what one sees as the ultimate solution. Like, I mean, if I see X solution as being the right thing to do, I don't want to take my time getting to it. I don't think it's a very principled statement. I think it's a very political statement. What is at stake there and what's really being referred to is a perception on the part of the public.
How about this then as a proposed solution that maybe you fellows can agree on? Workfare, a government program to oblige social welfare recipients to do some community service type work or job retraining, further education?
There again, we don't agree with the Harris government on workfare. Workfare is already proving itself to be a dud. Workfare, again, just takes jobs away from some people and gives them to others. It's a fancy name for what we've had before under all sorts of other job creation programs. What workfare does do, and again it's a matter of perception, is it gives a lot of tax-weary taxpayers the feeling that at least for the money that's being extracted from them, somebody might have to do something for it, just to get that little feeling of justice into the system. But it's just an illusion. It's not going to solve a problem. You can't create one job or create something called workfare without that affecting a terrible number of other things around it.
John Clarke, workfare?
Well, I think workfare has horrendous implications because it certainly feeds into a whole climate of hysteria and attack with regards to people on welfare and justifies deeper cuts. But also it introduces into the workforce a kind of a category of sub-worker, someone who has none of the normal rights that are attached to being even a non-unionised worker, somebody who's entirely at the mercy of the employer who receives the benefits of their forced labour. And that's bad for the people directly exploited, but it's also bad for the people who have to work in that same workplace. So it opens up the floodgates of cheap labour. Fortunately, and this is the same experience with the project work thing that they're trying to introduce in Britain at the moment, it's proving to be a complete fiasco. That people don't want anything to do with it, people resisting it, and Janet Ecker is, of course, in absolute crisis, surpassed only by the crisis of the finance minister, who doesn't seem to be able to get out of bed these mornings to issue a financial statement.
I guess by the end of the half hour we've found some measure of agreement, and at that I guess I would say our time's just about up. Thanks very much for doing this to John Clarke and to Robert Metz, and to our viewers, thanks for watching.
Thanks.
Yep.